Hello and welcome everyone to part 2 of the bone health presentation on vitamin D and exercise. This presentation is a follow-on from the part 1 which was done by Gemma on Monday. I was originally meant to be presenting this presentation the following Monday, but obviously because of the restrictions at the moment I'm doing this online instead. So I apologise for the quality if it isn't great. It's probably not as nice as me presenting in person with the chance for questions and discussion at the end, but we have to make do given the circumstances. I hope it still brings you some value and you get something out of it. So my name is Ellen and I'm also a student dietitian and I'm doing my community and public health placement at Nazareth College. So there are 3 main pillars to bone health. Gemma has already touched on number 1, which was calcium, and now I'll go through the importance of exercise and vitamin D and their role in bone health. So before I jump into my content for the session today, I wanted to do a quick recap on bone health from part 1 to make sure everyone is up to date on the same page, or if you've forgotten what we went through last week, this will be a good refresh before we go on to the second 2 pillars that I want to talk about today. So as Gemma talked about on Monday, osteoporosis is a silent disease. It can lead to brittle bones, and then brittle bones increase the risk of them breaking. There are no actual symptoms of osteoporosis, and that's why it's called a silent disease, and that's what makes it dangerous. There's no symptoms until an actual bone fracture occurs, and as the bones become thinner and less dense, even a minor bump or a minor fall can cause a serious fracture. So fractures lead to loss of independence and poorer health, so we want to avoid this at all costs. And to do that, we can focus on the prevention, and this includes our 3 pillars of bone health. So getting enough calcium in our diet, and then also the vitamin D and exercise, which I'll touch on during this presentation. So getting enough adequate calcium in our diet is important because as you age, your calcium requirements actually increase. So having enough dairy and then fortified non-dairy products as well. Gemma ran through some accessible and affordable ways to increase calcium in the diet, and then she also provided you with a resource which has some great ideas to increase calcium in the diet, and it gives you some food options and some tips for doing that. So if you're ever unsure, make sure you refer to those resources you were given last week because they have some great information in them. If you do have any questions that you forgot to ask last session or you would like to ask after watching this presentation, make sure you ring Katrina and let her know your question because she will write them all down for us, give them to Gemma and I, and then we will come up with some answers and send them back to you like a question and answer sheet in the mail. So don't hesitate to ask if you do have any questions from last session or this session. We're very happy to answer all of those for you. After that recap on the bone health part 1 presentation, I hope everyone's up to date and ready to go for the part 2 of the presentation. The first thing I'm talking about is vitamin D. So vitamin D has several roles in our bodies, but its main role is to help us absorb calcium from our food and drink. If our vitamin D levels are low, then we are unable to absorb all the calcium we eat or drink through our diet. So as that picture at the bottom of the slide shows, if we eat and drink all those calcium-rich food and drinks, we require that vitamin D for the calcium to be deposited into the bones. If we don't have enough vitamin D, the body will take the calcium from the stores in the bones because it's unable to absorb it, which weakens the bones and can lead to osteoporosis. So essentially, vitamin D helps absorb calcium, regulates calcium in the blood, and then supports essentially the growth and the maintenance of the skeleton, which is our bones. So how do we get that vitamin D from the sunlight and how much do we actually need? So I'll just explain to you how the vitamin D goes from the sun into our skin and then can be used by our bodies. The UVB radiation emitted from the sun is actually absorbed by our skin surface in the form of a D2. So vitamin D2 is what our skin absorbs from the sun, but then our liver and our kidneys convert it from D2 to D3, which is the active form that our bodies use. And for most Australians, the main source of vitamin D is from exposure to the sun. I'll show you in a moment. There's only a small amount we actually can get from food, so majority of our vitamin D is produced when our skin is exposed to the ultraviolet B light, which is the UVB radiation on the diagram on the left. So the amount of sun exposure required to produce adequate levels of vitamin D is actually relatively low, but many Australians don't have adequate vitamin D levels, especially during winter, because we're not getting that sun exposure that we need. Sun exposure times vary based on the season in Australia, the location, the skin type we have, and also the amount of skin exposed, which I'll run through with you shortly. So how much vitamin D do we actually need from the sunlight and from our food? So this probably doesn't mean much to anyone, but I did include it on the slide because it shows when you are over 70 years of age, your daily intake of vitamin D is greater than when you're under 70 years of age. So it actually goes up to 800 international units per day. And that probably doesn't mean much, but I'll show you how you can meet that through sunlight and through food. So sunlight actually takes up 90% of our vitamin D requirements, whereas food only makes up 10% of these requirements. You can get vitamin D through these two ways, but food cannot provide an adequate amount of vitamin D, and most people are reliant on the sun exposure to reach those recommended levels. So the vitamin D in the food we eat doesn't provide us with an adequate amount, so it's important to still get our main source of vitamin D from exposing our skin in the sun. But adding food options that contain small amounts of vitamin D is still going to be beneficial because our body will still absorb it and still use it. So although foods don't contain high levels of vitamin D, and no matter how much of this food you eat, you won't actually reach your requirements. It's essential to still get most of your vitamin D from the sun, but these foods do contain small amounts. So all the foods rich in calcium, so your dairy, your cheeses, your milk, your yogurts and your custards, they contain small amounts of vitamin D. Also fish like salmon, mackerel, tuna and sardines, they contain small amounts of vitamin D, as well as eggs and peas. And then mushrooms also contain a small amount of vitamin D. And a fun fact about mushrooms, the pigment in the skin of the mushroom is the same as the one we have in our skin. So it actually has not the same pigment, but it has the same ability to convert vitamin D2 from the sun into vitamin D3, which is the active form our bodies can use. So putting your mushrooms out in the sun before cooking them and eating them will actually mean you have the active form of vitamin D going straight into your body. So the sun exposure to get your required vitamin D depends on 3 different things. Number 1 is your age. So as I discussed before, people that are over 70 years of age have higher requirements for vitamin D. Number 2 was your skin type. So people with darker skin actually require more sunlight because the pigment in the darker skin reduces the penetration of UV light. Therefore, you need more exposure to the UV light to get the same amount of vitamin D. And number 3 is your location. So I'll show you that in a bit more detail in the next slide. But the resource I have provided you, or that Katrina will send out to you all, has this table in it. So you can refer back to that if you're unsure. But in general, for moderately to fair skin, in summer you require 5 to 10 minutes most days during the mid-morning or the mid-afternoon sun. And then in winter you require 7 to 30 minutes most days during the middle of the day. And then people with darker skin require even more sunlight. So in summer that goes up to 15 minutes to an hour in the mid-morning or afternoon. and then 20 minutes to 3 hours at midday in winter. So it's quite a lot more sun exposure in darker skinned people than the moderately to fair skinned people. So this slide will just give you a brief overview of the sun exposure required in the different states of Australia in order to meet your vitamin D requirements. So in the northern areas of Australia, typically you only need a few minutes on most days to meet your vitamin D requirements. But down here in South Australia, we require a few minutes on most days in summer, but then up to 2 to 3 hours per week in winter, which is about 30 minutes a day, is adequate to meet your vitamin D levels. But as I discussed in the previous slide, it depends on your age, your skin type, and your location. So if you have darker skin, you actually require more sun exposure than that, but if you have lighter skin, that applies to you. So just looking through that resource if you're unsure still, and making sure you are getting adequate exposure to the sun. So now I've summarized vitamin D and the requirements for vitamin D to maintain your bone health. I'm now going to talk about exercise. So regular physical activity and exercise plays an important role in maintaining or improving your bone density. So many of you actually mentioned last session that you have had a bone density scan done, but for those of you who haven't, it may actually be worth getting one of these done. To do this, you can go through your doctor and they can refer you to get one of these done. I did have a look and Medicare does cover it for anyone over the age of 70 or for someone with suspected or monitoring of low bone density. So make sure to discuss this with your doctor because it actually might be worth getting one of these done just to check on your bone density. So exercise must be regular and ongoing to have a proper benefit for bone and muscles surrounding the bone. Exercise increases the size, strength and capacity of our muscles surrounding the bone, which is important for balance, strength and preventing falls. Our bones become stronger when a certain amount of impact or extra strain is placed on them. So this means that there are specific types of exercises that are actually better for bone than others. So in elderly age group in particular, it's important to exercise at least 3 times a week with a combination of weight-bearing exercise and resistance training exercises. I'll explain these in a bit more detail, but there's also a table in the resource you'll be sent outlining the exercises that are particularly good for maintaining your bone at each age group. So specific exercises are important for improving bone strength. So weight-bearing exercises are exercises which are done while you're on your feet, so you're bearing your own weight. So this can mean brisk walking, jogging, skipping, sports like basketball or netball, or tennis, even dancing, or impact aerobics or stair walking. Anything that you have your own weight on your feet and you're using your weight to press down. That's what it means by weight bearing. Getting outdoors and walking is also beneficial for bone health to get the vitamin D in there as well. Progressive resistance training, which are exercises that become more challenging over time. For example, lifting weights, so starting with a low weight and then gradually getting stronger and increasing your weight, which can mean hand weights or even ankle weights or gym equipment. This is also important to maintain your bone strength and putting pressure on the bone. So lastly, I wanted to talk about balance exercises because balance and mobility exercises do not necessarily improve bone or muscle strength, but they can help reduce falls. So exercising that assists with balancing includes standing on one leg, particularly with your eyes closed, heel to toe walking, or even Tai Chi that I know you've all been doing recently. So because falls are a common cause of fractures, especially for people with osteoporosis, including some balancing exercises, although they don't improve the bone or muscle strength, they can help reduce falls, which can help reduce fractures. So I just wanted to show this quick summary slide, which just shows 3 simple actions for stronger bones. So it's what we've gone through over the last 2 presentations. So consuming your calcium, so milk, cheese and yogurts, or also your calcium fortified non-dairy alternatives. Adding that with exercising, so trying to exercise at least 3 times a week with weight bearing or resistance training exercise, and also including your balancing exercise in there as well to prevent your risk of falls. And lastly, getting enough vitamin D for sunshine. So getting checks with your doctor to make sure you are getting adequate levels of vitamin D, and making sure to expose yourself in the sun when you can. So just to summarize what I've gone through today, there are 3 pillars of bone health. So calcium, which Gemma ran through in part 1, vitamin D and exercise, which I've gone through today. So vitamin D helps with the absorption and the regulation of calcium. So it's important we're getting enough vitamin D in to help absorb that calcium that we take in our diet. The main source of vitamin D is from the sun, although you can get small amounts from foods, but the main source is from the sunlight. And then exercise is also important for the strength of our muscles, to help us balance and to maintain our bone strength as well. Weight bearing exercise and resistance training for bones is most beneficial. And then balance exercises are also important to incorporate into your weekly exercise regime to prevent the risk of falls. So thank you so much to everyone who attended the part 1 of the bone health session, and I'm really sorry we couldn't actually do this session in person as well. I would have really loved to have some discussion at the end and answer all your questions, but make sure if you do have any questions that you do ring Katrina and let her know, because she will collect all those questions and send them to Gemma and I, and then we'll come up with some answers and send them all back to you. So don't hesitate to ask any questions if you have any from session 1 or this session today. We will happily answer your questions. And keep well and stay safe, everybody. Thanks for watching.